Last summer, while driving to Ontario to visit another Canadian landowner to check out his deer hunting property in order to create a habitat plan, I rolled into the border crossing at Port Huron in the Sarnia, where the Canadian border agent asked where I was headed and why. When I told him, he handed my passport back to me and pointed ahead to the customs office and told me to talk to an agent inside there where they would have a few questions for me. The agent there also asked me what I was up to, and when I told him, he asked why the landowner contacted me instead of a consultant who lives in Canada. I explained that the landowner said he couldn't find anyone in Canada who does what I do, so the agent told me to have a seat and chill out for a bit. 20 minutes later, he calls me back in and says he couldn't find anyone online either, but says Ontario has foresters that might be able to help the landowner. When I explained I had been to other properties there in the past, he said that they have a new Canada First policy, and I had two choices. Either turn around and go back home, or if I went ahead and still visited with a landowner, then I would not be able to enter Canada for at least 1 year or more, even if only driving through as a shortcut to other clients in New York. Well, since I travel to upstate New York a couple times a year to visit other landowners, I decided to turn around and head home. Since then, I have done only virtual plans for landowners in Ontario. In most cases, this makes a lot more sense anyway, because some of those properties are simply too far away and remote, like Neil's property on Manitou Island and Jordan's property in northeast Alberta. Traveling to properties that far away is too time-consuming and too costly for the landowner. So instead of the landowner showing me around in person, I mentioned how he can show me around through the lens of a video camera on his phone while explaining his property features to me as if I'm walking with him. These virtual plans are usually only about a third of the cost of an in-person visit and plan. But not every property is a good candidate for the virtual option. Much of it depends on terrain, topography, property size and percentage of timber, thick cover, swamp, and ag. 20 to 80 acres, excluding ag fields and open water, is very doable, but I always want to look at a few different aerials to see if it's a good fit before committing to it. In the case of Jordan's 80 acres up in northeast Alberta, it was a good fit. First, we did a screen share on Zoom so I could get an idea of the areas I wanted him to film for me with his phone. We laid out a route for him to film that would give me a real good overview of his property. It always works better when the landowner takes several shorter video clips instead of just one big long video. And since he had a Gmail account, he could simply attach the video clips to an email, and Gmail would automatically put them into a Google Drive folder with a link for me to download them. Once I reviewed the video clips a couple times, we jumped back on Zoom together so I could get a few more detailed questions answered before I start developing a plan with a hunting strategy. Here's an example of a couple of the video clips he sent to me.
So this is the main yard site. It's a couple acres. This is a new pond that was dug this summer. And then over here is an old horse pasture. It's about 1.5 acres. I had worked it up this summer. However, I didn't spray it and the weeds came back pretty quick. So plans were to redo it again here next year and hopefully make this into some sort of food plot. Anywho, we'll continue on. The property is 80 acres like I had told you, and it's a mix of swamp, some good farmland, I guess. A couple high patches of high ground is kind of what makes everything up here. Right now we would be heading south from the main yard site. This is another trail that heads west that kind of ends up at the pond and in a laydown area out back. You get a lot of action here with the deer coming from the field to the bush here and then over to the swamp area. Back in here the land is higher, and it's mostly a lot of large poplars in here. I do have a lot of also of this dying alders and stuff like that. There is a little bit of spruce, not very much however. This area here goes down to the swamp to the west we were talking about, and there's a couple larger spruce here and a little bit of salt out.
As you can see, much of his property is wet most of the year. The southern half is pretty much wet swamp where you would need some serious equipment to make any habitat improvements. So he was limited to only a few areas of dry ground where he could add some much needed food, since most of the neighboring fields were just grass and hay for cattle. Fortunately, he had a real good trail system going around and through the property, so that would make his progress a little easier. He also had some areas where he could harvest some big poplars and aspen to produce some great woody browse and bedding cover to complement the food plots. So without going into too much detail, here's the habitat plan he received that'll create a lot more predictability to where deer will bed, how they travel through the property toward food, and creating pinch points by laying down trees that'll force bucks through these funnels during daylight hours of the rut phases. So these barricades that I have illustrated here with the yellow and black lines are nothing more than trees laying down, whether you cut them off flush and lay them all down in a row, or if you hinge cut them. But on this property, being most of it's going to be softwood, very few of these trees are actually going to hinge very well. So it's just a matter of cutting down a bunch of trees and making it difficult for deer to go through here and then making them go around the barricade. So with a barricade pointing up here to the northwest, one down here to the southwest, it's naturally going to funnel these deer right through this pinch point here, because we do have a lot of bedding going on the neighbors off to the west. And so as these deer come out of bedding and make their way toward the food plot, they're naturally going to want to go right through this pinch point here. And this pinch point, I would say, would be about 30 yards or so. So then at that point, all you got to do is put a tree stand here along the end of this barricade on the north side for any southerly wind, and then put another tree stand here along the north end of this barricade during a southerly wind, and you're going to get a lot more deer traffic coming right through here. And then as they make their way through this bedding area, and whether or not this bedding area is going to be select cut to let some sunlight in here for some new regen and browse and cover, and if there's any trees that will hinge in here, that's just a bonus. But we're just trying to open up the sunlight in these areas to create better bedding, which is right next to food. And then on the far end of the food, we have a blind that is tucked in behind a visual screen of either trees or planted tall grass. But we don't want any deer seeing us coming off this orange trail here and getting into the back of the blind and boogering up the food plot. So we have to absolutely hide this blind. But then we put in some licking branches for mock scrapes, which is what the yellow dots are. And having a couple right here within shooting distance of these tree stands is very effective. We also add a water hole within bow range of the stand. And once all this is in place, then you can add in some crabapple trees, which are the red dots. And so with this scenario, you have a very predictable, repeatable deer pattern that you can count on. And if you hide this blind well enough, you can actually hunt it multiple times without boogering up the food plot. Now, once we get into the rut phases, what you're going to have is you're going to have mature bucks going around the food plot instead of walking right through the middle of a food plot during daylight hours, right? So a lot of times, no matter where you are in the country, you're going to find these faint trails that go around food plots and fields that are 25 to 30 yards inside the cover off the food. And so that's what's going to happen here. You're going to start getting bucks to circumvent on the downwind side of this food plot, and he can scent check this food plot as he walks around the southern end of it if the wind is coming out of the north, like we have here. This is the windrows, and you can see there's a lot of northwest winds in this area. And so with that wind, this buck is going to walk around on this dotted blue line. And so this gives us then the opportunity to put in another barricade right here, put a stand at the end of the barricade, so you're forcing these bucks to walk around this food plot between the end of the barricade and the food plot, and puts them right in front of that tree stand as he walks around this food plot. These little strategies are very easy to do. You just have to sit back and look at it from a 40,000-foot view and imagine how you can create these situations on your property. Here's another example with this barricade right here. Now, this is not really related to food. This is just a patch of cover that moves east to west toward food. But you can imagine how many deer trails are going through this thick cover right here between these two access trails. Because this is too thick up there in that wilderness area, you can't cover the whole thing, especially with the bow. So the way to do that is to get the deer to come out around and come toward you. And by putting in a barricade right here, force them out to the outside, you can put your stand right here close to this trail and get these deer to come within bow range as they pass by. So again, you're going to want to put a stand here on the south end of this barricade for those northerly winds, and put another stand up here on the north end for those southerly winds. And then the last example I'll point out here is this is the field that was to the south of the house. This is where they had a horse pasture that they're going to turn into a food plot. And so if they do that, then they are going to want to encase this food plot with some switchgrass, right, in order to block all their human activity. But then this will give them about a 1 acre food plot of grains. And I always like to put a strip of clover along the wood line edge, because deer like to make scrapes within clover versus like putting scrapes in brassicas or something tall. But if this becomes food, now you're going to have bucks that are going to want to go around this food and scent check deer that are in the food. And the way to make this almost bulletproof is to put in another barricade right here from this trail going north, leave about a 30 to 40 yard gap between the end of the barricade and the edge of the food plot, and let these bucks walk through cover around that food plot. But yet, because your stand's going to be right here at the end of the barricade, this buck is going to walk 15 to 20 yards right in front of you with any kind of a northerly wind. And you'll notice that the stands here that are off the food that capitalize on these buck circumventing food plots are in red, where the stands and blinds that are related to food are in orange, which means that the orange stands you can hunt during the early season when deer are in that bed to food, food to bed mode. But then when you get into the rut phases where these bucks start cruising during midday, that's when you want to get off the food and into these red stands. And I always have my best luck in these red stands off the food about 40, 50 yards once we hit that last week of October, and then for the next 3 weeks. So from about the last week of October through the middle of November, that's when I like to be in these situations. And I like to be in the stand from, say, at least 9 a.m. till 1 p.m. in the afternoon. That midday time frame is when I see a lot of mature buck activity cruising through cover, going around food plots, going around bedding areas for these mature bucks that are scent checking for hot estrus does. So as I said before, this property is a good candidate for a virtual plan. Not all properties are, and I don't take them all on because of the terrain or topography. Every property is a case-by-case situation. But this one here ought to go a long way to creating a lot of predictable opportunities for the landowner, and this plan will put the landowner in a position where he will see more bucks. So if you got any good ideas out of this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next video.